Welcome to the two-day extravaganza of the Max Bell School of Public Policy Policy Lab presentations. My name is Chris Reagan. I'm the director of the Max Bell School. Let me begin by saying that I am coming to you today from my home in Gimli, Manitoba, which is situated on what is referred to as Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe. Many of you are actually closer to McGill's downtown Montreal campus, in which case you are on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, what we often call the Mohawk Nation. But wherever you are currently sitting, and many of you are from outside of Canada today, I encourage you to better understand the history of your location and to recognize its Indigenous heritage. Now, let me actually very briefly give you the rules of engagement for the next 1 hour. First of all, the team is going to have exactly 30 minutes for its presentation. And at the 28-minute mark, they are going to hear my egg timer, which sounds like this. Just a second. Okay, I hope you all heard that. It'll be longer when it actually goes. So that'll be a 2-minute warning. Then we're going to have 10 minutes of Q&A from the faculty. And in this case, that's going to be Jennifer Welsh, Natalie Duchesnay, and Niadi. Then we're going to have 10-minute Q&A from the sponsors. And in this case, that's the CMHC. And then we're going to have 10 minutes of a general Q&A from the audience. So I encourage you all, if you have a question, if a question comes to mind as you're listening to the presentation, please put the question in the chat box, and then I will collect them as we're going through that 30-minute Q&A. So without further ado, this is team number 1. The sponsor is the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the CMHC, and the policy challenge is about what policies and solutions could best support access to housing in Canada for those that experience discrimination. So without further ado, Max Bell team number 1, take it away.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're thrilled to talk to you today and look forward to hearing your feedback. The team is made up of Alexandra Aegis, Mariela Aramburu, Rudena Bahubeshi, Rebecca Charles, and myself, Ricardo Chepik. We're all Master of Public Policy candidates at McGill University, and the following presentation will outline the main lessons and recommendations from the program's capstone project. Our research was sponsored by CMHC, and we were tasked with investigating housing discrimination as well as ways to mitigate it. Today, my colleague Rudena will walk us through the methodology of the report, expanding on our research question, key informant, and the theoretical lenses that informed us throughout. Rebecca will follow, summarizing our findings regarding the different shapes of housing discrimination, as well as zero in on the effects of anti-Blackness in the housing realm. Marielle will then outline the existing mechanisms for addressing housing discrimination in Canada and give an overview of the areas where we've identified opportunities for change. Alex will describe in detail our recommendations regarding the state of data and information, as well as accountability. And I will conclude the presentation with opportunities in the state of housing supply and some additional considerations. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Rudena.
Thanks so much, Ricardo. Good morning, everyone. So at the outset of our project, we developed a few research questions to guide our focus and findings, as listed on this slide. They are, what is housing discrimination? How and where is it most common and severe? Who is affected and who is most at risk? What might CMHC's role be in enabling housing discrimination and helping curb it? And what is Canada's commitment to the right to adequate housing? We found that while housing discrimination is broadly understudied and poorly understood, there is evidence it occurs across housing types and experienced by many communities. In this report, we sought to narrow our scope to provide examples of how the problem manifests and draw attention to some of the individuals who might be at the greatest risk. With that, we made 3 key choices with our focus. So we decided to focus on urban centers. This is where most renters live and where the housing crisis is most pronounced, with high costs and low vacancy rates. This is also where most racialized people, newcomers, and immigrants live. In particular, we looked at Toronto, the area of interest for most of the academic research we found on housing discrimination. And one of the most expensive and populated cities, which are also factors that it can increase the chance of discrimination. Toronto is also home to more than 35% of Black people in Canada. We also look at Halifax and Vancouver, which have been sites of Black settlement and displacement and are the focus of CMHC's work to address their role in anti-Black racism in both Hogan's Alley in Vancouver and Africville in Nova Scotia. So we decided to focus on Black communities for many reasons, including the severity of anti-Blackness across systems, so such as housing, food security, education, incarceration, and more, as well as the absence of Black communities in CMHC's research and strategies until quite recently. And also because of the clear evidence of anti-Blackness in the rental market that we found in our research. So while there's undoubtedly evidence of discrimination in homeownership, such as in acquiring mortgages or how real estate agents steer some communities away from whiter, wealthier neighborhoods, we decided to focus on renters because they are more likely to be at risk of economic marginalization. This limits their choice, limits their power to address discrimination, and increases the risk of eviction and or even homelessness. So on this next slide are a handful of our expert interviewees. We interviewed 21 individuals that helped inform the direction of this work and who had expertise in different aspects of housing, whether in human rights and legal frameworks, social housing, housing development, grassroots advocacy, and much, much more. 1/3 of these experts came from civil society, 1/3 from government, and the remainder from academia, law, and housing development. We had the good fortune of being able to interview several of these experts more than once, early in the process, and then again to provide feedback on our recommendations. So a couple of key lenses were used throughout the process to ground our work in key principles aligned with our commitment to justice and social well-being. We used an equity lens. We developed questions and considerations to guide our work that recognize one-size-fits-all policies are not a route to equitable outcomes. Equity requires distributive justice and forces us to look at outcomes to ensure equal opportunity. Our research and informants pressed us to look at the role of race and economic class in particular. At the same time, we did this work through an intersectional lens, paying attention to how all facets of identity affect one's experience in the housing market, including gender, sexuality, disability, race, class, and immigrant status. And in addition, we considered how living at the intersections of multiple of these identities might further the risk of being subject to discrimination. Another key lens in our work was a human rights-based approach to housing. So as with international frameworks, including the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and national frameworks in Canada, like the Housing Act, this report is aligned with the principle that housing is a human right. That principle clearly prohibits housing discrimination, forced evictions, and requires taking significant steps for the progressive realization of housing for all. It also requires prioritizing those in greatest need and recognizes housing as a necessary requirement to participating in society. So I'll now pass it on to my classmate, Rebecca, who will discuss housing discrimination in further detail.
Thank you, Rudena. Hello, everyone. These are the categories of housing discrimination we identified. First, we identified direct housing discrimination at inquiry, where discriminatory denial of housing is made by landlords, home sellers, real estate agents. Research has been conducted with paired testing audits, comparing two prospective tenants or buyers, trying to access the same housing with different profiles, concluding that discrimination was most common on the basis of race, ethnicity, and gender, and intersecting effect. Secondly, discrimination can be the sour fruit of policies or the absence of policies that puts everyone in the same basket without considerations, lacking an equity lens. The housing quest can be much harder for marginalized groups. There is a lack of accessible information in the housing market provided to populations such as newcomers and refugees. There are also laws that enable landlords to request a lot of private information and requirements such as credit checks, which can be more difficult to attain for specific groups. Third, a system's use shows particular populations are more at risk of living in homelessness, having core housing needs, and or living in underserved, segregated communities. Data show that Black and racialized households are twice subjected to core housing needs. Refugees, as well as recent immigrants, are facing these types of problems. Therefore, this is why we see that the problem of housing discrimination is really, really, really important. Finally, there is the problem of the financialization of housing and its tension with the right to adequate housing. Housing as a human right, as mentioned before, does not mean housing is guaranteed. The financialization of housing creates an environment where housing is regarded as a commodity instead of a right. The burden of social risk is placed on individuals rather than state, and this contributes to the issue. Also, beyond the private market, the deep lack of affordable and social housing creates housing precarity for those with low income. Now I'm going to talk about the core housing need in anti-Blackness. Black and Indigenous poverty and precarity have been shaped by state policies and agencies that still perpetuate the marginalization. The history of land dispossession and slavery that subjugated Indigenous and Black people in Canada continues to influence social, political, and cultural sphere and urban development system of oppression that are all interconnected. In part, this history can be observed in the disproportionate low number of Black ownership compared to their counterparts. Anti-Blackness can also be observed through decades of private and public sector divestment of housing and transit, resulting in housing that is neglected and in disrepair and poor transit and public infrastructure for certain communities. Ongoing systemic racism, including anti-Black racism in social, economic, and cultural spheres, remains prevalent. The data gap is a profound indicator that historically there has been limited targeted political will or actions to improve Black and Indigenous people's life through disaggregated data. A failure to recognize how anti-Blackness deeply impacts the way Black people experience life, access services, and the treatment they receive. Gaps in public policy have contributed to perpetuating the systemic housing discrimination. Furthermore, the burden of proof in instances of racism and discrimination amplifies the problem. There is greater urgency in the pandemic for Black people who experience racism and disproportionate rates of economic marginalization. Conclusions from a 2020 Wellesley Institute study showed that Black renters face a higher likelihood of eviction, with census tracts of 36% of Black renter households facing twice the eviction rates of tracts with 2% Black households. During the COVID-19 pandemic, cost of rent dropped in some cases, and vacancy rates increased in many major Canadian cities. But this trend did not benefit equity-seeking groups, since the change was most evident among more expensive housing stock. COVID-19 is both a health and economic crisis that amplified social inequities, leading to increased eviction and housing precarity. However, discrimination is not only about overt acts of racism, but also includes ignoring the presence of inequalities. Now, my colleague Muriel will follow with the existing efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. We would be remiss not to highlight the many existing efforts working to address housing discrimination. There are several legislative protections explicitly prohibiting discrimination, including the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms as a supreme law, which of course applies to all levels of government, the Canadian Bill of Rights and the Canadian Human Rights Act, and the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, applies to the federal government, agencies, corporations, and federally regulated businesses. As Rudena mentioned, Canada is also a signatory to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and is also a party to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Provincial and territorial human rights codes also include important protections against discrimination, including housing. In practice, filing a complaint under these commissions or tribunals who administer the code and serve as adjudicatory bodies is often both resource and time intensive. In addition, when trials are successful, compensation may not align with the effort required from the injured party, nor the impact of discrimination they experienced. With permission from the Library of Canada, we've included an appendix in our report on housing rights in provincial and territorial human rights codes. Provincial and territorial residential tenancy acts typically establish landlord and tenant boards. These boards provide dispute resolution services, such as mediation, for tenants and landlords according to the rights and responsibilities outlined in the Act. Under the landlords and tenant boards may also importantly issue eviction orders. And as a legislative function, there's also a great deal of promise for the Federal Housing Strategy Act, a $70 billion 10-year overarching federal strategy and funding framework. This includes a National Housing Council and a federal housing advocate who will be hosted and supported by the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Specifically, the housing advocate may wish to explore carrying out its own review of housing discrimination as a systemic housing issue and barrier, meet with equity-seeking groups and civil society organizations to amplify their voices, and request a review panel and hearing on housing discrimination to be established by the National Housing Council. There are also several ongoing grassroots efforts directed at housing discrimination and institutional inequities in housing and for Black communities in Canada. The Hogan's Alley Society has been a strong advocate in Vancouver. Meanwhile, in Halifax, Eddie Carvery, a displaced resident of Africville, has been calling for a public inquiry and reparations for over 20 years. There are several other community groups advocating for the former residents of Africville, and arguably more space for greater community partnership through working with more individuals and organizations than those that have been historically engaged in Africville, as well as more generally, more broadly, is one identified priority that should be emphasized across CMHC's work. There are several organizations advancing research or advocacy on housing discrimination, as well as providing direct supports to households. These include the Center for Equality, Rights and Accommodation, who we thank for attending this presentation today, Maytree, and the Wellesley Institute. Newcomer agencies and associations, community unions such as Acorn Canada, tenant unions, and mutual aid all provide different frontline supports to residents and are actively working against discrimination. Often, these organizations are led by volunteers and community members and have limited budgets. Having taken stock at existing efforts to address housing discrimination, there are also several opportunities our team recognized that have the potential to provide meaningful, impactful, and long-lasting change. We've grouped them into three main buckets: information and data, accountability, and housing supply. At first glance, some recommendations may seem more directly related to housing discrimination than others. But as Rebecca mentioned, there are many ways in which housing discrimination is deeply embedded in our structures and systems. In the following slides, we'll share recommendations that address the many types of housing discrimination discussed earlier, and consider the financialization of housing, affordability, and the right to adequate housing. As we provide an overview of these recommendations, we will also highlight the role we see CMHC playing. At the end of the presentation, Ricardo will also touch on partners we've identified for these recommendations, all of which are more thoroughly discussed in the report. Alexandra will kick us off by discussing opportunities in housing and data and information.
Thank you, Marielle. Data and information is one crucial element in addressing housing discrimination, with a number of different potential opportunities for specific ways in which to better collect and utilize data. First and foremost, there needs to be greater clarity on what housing discrimination actually is. Canada needs a specific definition on what constitutes as housing discrimination, be it racially motivated or otherwise, in order to better address the issue at hand. Currently, there exist different definitions within different legislation, as well as different definitions provided by academics on the subject. CMHC can advocate for such a definition to be both created and implemented nationwide. Secondly, there needs to be race-based disaggregated data to be both collected and utilized, something that CMHC can work closely with Statistics Canada in the execution of. This practice has already been spearheaded within the province of British Columbia, where the annual homeless count has worked to actively collect race-based disaggregated data on the local homeless population in order to better identify specific community needs. Third, there is a need for more information to be available to both landlords and tenants around rights, responsibilities, and resources. As an organization, CMHC can take an active role in both funding agencies that support landlord and tenant education programs, as well as working to distribute such information independently. Perhaps most critically, there is a need for a national audit on housing discrimination. Such an audit could be conducted similarly to those conducted within the United States and would provide both CMHC and other agencies with a wealth of information on the prevalence of housing discrimination in Canada in order to better ascertain what specific policies need to be enacted. This may be also something that the National Housing Advocate could explore, given their mandate to initiate studies into economic, institutional, or industry conditions. In the realm of accountability, there are similarly a number of potential opportunities for CMHC. Landlord licensing, a practice currently being explored within Canadian cities such as Toronto, could be expanded on a larger scale and could support an open access database for potential tenants on local landlords. CMHC could advocate for such programming and work to form greater connections with Canadian municipalities to push landlord licensing forward. Related to municipalities, there is also a need for increased jurisdictional coordination. Housing discrimination is a complex issue, which needs all levels of government to take an active role in finding solutions and working together in order to facilitate problem solving. CMHC can work to actively increase communication with multiple levels of government on housing discrimination, as well as working to collect best practices from different jurisdictions within Canada. There is also a need for more focused strategies oriented towards the Black population. What this could look like are dedicated funding streams for confronting anti-Black racism, as well as working to ensure that the National Housing Advocate both recognizes the prevalence of systemic anti-Black racism and actively works to find solutions. CMHC also has the opportunity to better fund tenant support agencies and to support those at the front lines of working against illegal evictions and supporting tenants in need. Similarly, CMHC can also work to address the issue of illegal evictions, particularly by strengthening access to legal aid and by advocating for stronger legislative measures. These and other opportunities are recommendations for CMHC to really become a leader in fighting against housing discrimination and in working to build a more equitable society for all of us. With that in mind, I will now turn it over to my colleague Ricardo for our team's final grouping of recommendations on housing supply. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Canada is in the midst of a housing crisis. and one that has been particularly marked by a lack of affordable rental homes in urban centers across the nation. This is one key contributor to housing discrimination, as it restricts the right to housing of low-income households and can create a market in which landlords have even greater power. Further, data indicates that immigrants, racialized individuals, single parents, and people with disabilities are all significantly overrepresented among those renters experiencing core housing need or occupying social housing. As a result, one key element to addressing housing discrimination is working to create more affordable rental homes through various policy methods, prioritizing those whose models are best equipped at fostering equity and mitigating discrimination. Our first recommendation is concerned with increasing the social housing supply, an area in which Canada is particularly lacking, as it made up just 6% of the country's housing stock as of 2014. Given that social housing is the only existing large-scale model that is specifically designed to assist the people in the most financial need, and considering the intersection between poverty and race, a lack of social housing is particularly harmful to Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. We identified several strategies for increasing Canada's social and deeply affordable housing stock that match the urgency in which this increase is needed. A full list can be found in the report, but notable examples include promoting the acquisition of buildings where the enforcement of standards has failed to ensure decent repair, supporting inclusionary zoning, reconfiguring funding programs where a percentage of units is guaranteed to remain affordable to instead request to be turned into social housing. Next, we recommend CMHC support community land trusts, which are an ideal housing model for the problem of discrimination because they don't only promote and help ensure perpetual affordability, but they also grant self-determination to its residents. Allowing the community to be deeply involved in their housing and social programming can help avoid the creation and enforcement of discriminatory policies, in particular those that often accompany commercial rental organizations. In this regard, CMHC could promote the development of new community land trusts and support existing ones through raising awareness, new funding programs, and capacity development, building on their existing research and the newly released demonstrations initiative. Considering the role housing affordability plays in modulating interpersonal and systemic discrimination, CMHC could encourage the federal government to expand the Canada Housing Benefit. This would be critical to protect renters from precarity when housing becomes unaffordable, and it could either be achieved through an increase in the existing transfer to the provinces or new funding programs modeled after Canada Emergency Commercial Rental Assistance or Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy. But when creating new deeply affordable housing stock, we must ensure that communities being pushed furthest to the margins are among those accessing these new units. Similar to what we saw in Toronto last year, where 2 new developments included reserved units for single mothers, we recommend CMHC explore new funding strategies where we can ensure that communities in the most need are being prioritized. New social housing and deeply affordable units should be available to these communities and developments throughout the city, as research indicates that segregation in cities like Toronto is getting worse and not better, and we must seek to break this trend. This can be done through the aforementioned reserve units or less direct methods like exploring the funding application process, finding ways to properly prioritize developers with cultural competency, ties to the affected community, and a demonstrated stake on the issue. This chart is an illustration of a section of our report that details CMHC's role in each recommendation. At times, they are a lead, a partner, or a supporter, working in collaboration with other governments, organizations, or communities, and building on current initiatives, as well as embarking on new funding streams and projects. Some of them call on CMHC to take a central role in their development, while others call for it to use its position in the housing realm to promote best practices and inform the public. A full breakdown of our assessment can be found in the summary of recommendations section, but notably, and as you can see from this chart, all of the recommendations call for partnerships with governments or government agencies, and most of them with various parts of civil society, illustrating the need for cooperation in addressing these issues. These recommendations are about eradicating discrimination in housing, interpersonal and systemic, but they are also about creating a radically different future, one with thriving communities where well-being is prioritized over profits and where housing is realized as a human right. We thank our sponsor, CMHC, and our coach, Dr. Lucy Locke. We hope you found our presentation insightful and that our research can help inform the important work CMHC helps champion and lead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, team. You didn't even go to the bell ring. I'll just do that for you, just for completeness. Perfect timing. Very nice presentation. Okay, let me start with three faculty members: Jennifer Welsh, Natalie Duchesnay, and Nee Addy. Now I didn't see any questions in the chat box.
Oh, I have some.
So, okay, good. Let's turn it to Jennifer. Jennifer, you kick us off, please.
Hi, good morning. It's great to hear your presentation. I hope they'll be quick. I have a few questions, so I'll just lay all of them out and then you can choose who wants to respond. The first one was a little bit more about your process. I'm curious to know what you learned from your interviews that changed your focus or changed the direction you were going in. So what specifically did the interviews generate for you in the project? The second one is, you mentioned a few times in the report a national normative information campaign. And I wanted a better sense of why you think this is important, but also how effective you think something like that would be. We're flooded with information in our society. So, you know, what is this and how important is it to your strategy? And then lastly, there's a few, you've probably thought about this, but there's a few areas in the report where you talk about CMHC funding X or Y. And I just want to understand how you think CMHC can get the funding it needs to do this work. So those are my questions, hopefully brief, Chris, so that others can pitch in.
Okay, team, you want to take a shot at Jennifer's questions, then we'll go to Nee and then Natalie.
I could pick up perhaps on the process question to kick us off. So yeah, it was a really rich interview and data gathering and information gathering process. I think after doing a bit of a literature review and then speaking to experts, it was really confirmed to us that there is indeed very little known about housing discrimination. And so making those selections and scope was really challenging because it's so broad and there's so much we don't know. But I think by, for instance, picking Black populations, by bringing that equity of principle of equity to consider some of the people pushed furthest to the margins, we developed some recommendations that we know were also going to benefit all marginalized populations by sort of starting with some of the people most impacted. We knew that we'd be able to make policies that would consider exclusion across various identities. And then with the rental market, again, it was about also prioritizing some of the people who might be worst off in this situation and considering the COVID framing as well. But I think the real dearth of the information and action really allowed us to hone in on that first recommendation bucket of data and information. And that was definitely something that was important to have confirmed by experts in addition to our research that we were on the right track with.
And I think just to speak to the normative information campaign, I think we agree there is so much information. And when we were discussing, we were trying to identify a way that, you know, the average person living in Canada could recognize housing discrimination. Because we believe that that is an issue that I think the nuances of housing discrimination are not always as visible. Residents or people living in Canada may not be aware of what constitutes housing discrimination or what rights and responsibilities they do have, either as tenants or landlords. And so we really do see an opportunity for an informational campaign. And we know CMHC does have the capacity and the experience of carrying out these national campaigns where, you know, working together with provinces, municipalities, and other groups, we believe it could be very powerful. And one example we give in the report, and I think we would leave it to CMHC's marketing team, but one idea was having a type of Canadian Heritage Minute, where you maybe play out a scenario of what housing discrimination can look like And I think as we can see with issues such as racism, a lot of people don't initially self-identify when that is occurring or where they are helping perpetuate that. So we do think that there's an opportunity to personalize or make it more real to the average person living in Canada, as well as amplify the current existing efforts and the structures that are in place to protect housing discrimination. And I think for your final question, Professor Walsh, on funding, we do believe that the way that we've tried to frame our recommendations, a lot of times it's identifying current funding envelopes that could either be more targeted towards the specifics that we suggest, or slightly altered. Some of these, include research envelopes that currently exist that could be just slightly modified. We also believe the minister responsible for CMHC has made a commitment for Black communities. And so we also think that that is a space that could be further expanded, as well as with information and data. Statistics Canada did announce a disaggregated data action plan recently with over $100 million. So we see an opportunity for CMHC to work closely with that funding to ensure that figures and statistics on housing discrimination can be ensured to be recognized.
Okay, Niadi is next with his question.
Yes, so thanks very much. This was very insightful for me. Question I had is related to something, Marielle, you were just talking about, the campaigns, right? And I'll just, this goes to the whole team, the different stories, cases that you outline in your report. And I was just wondering, which of these stories or cases would you say were very striking, along the lines of what Jennifer also asked about, what did you learn from the interviews and so on? But I was just curious about what was really striking in terms of the stories that you think captures some of what you're talking about. As you said, very often people don't realize the extent of the problems. So, is there a particular story or case that you might really highlight?
I'm happy to start us off on this one. I think for me offhand, a lot of the stories that I think were really critical to keep in mind were those centered around the issue of illegal evictions. There is this kind of narrative that once you have secured housing, you have jumped over that barrier of, facing potential discriminatory practices. You're there, you signed a lease, you're good to go. But, for us in conducting interviews with people such as Cole Weber, who is one of the tenant advocates over in Parkdale, hearing the stories about individuals and about entire communities facing evictions en masse throughout the COVID-19 crisis, and about some of the issues that were really coming up there. Just the incredible lack of support and resources available to tenants at this point in time, as well as the difficulties of facing an eviction process online, was really, really striking. I think also on the realm of specifically looking at illegal evictions, looking at issues such as the issue of N12s in Ontario, where landlords have the ability to claim that a suite or property is going to be used by a relative, but often don't actually use it for that. Just hearing the stories of individuals facing that particular scenario was really difficult to hear, because quite frankly, these were people who had oftentimes lived in specific properties with set rental rates for 5, 10, 15 years, and suddenly we're on the brink of homelessness because of a lack of legal support measures to ensure that landlords were being held accountable. And I think among all of the different individual narratives we heard of all of these individuals facing really serious issues on the front lines of the evictions crisis, it really kind of painted a broader picture of the fact that this is an issue that is facing all areas of Canadian society. While it does disproportionately impact people who are racialized, who are women, who are living with disabilities, it can target anybody. And I think it really speaks to the fact that this is an issue that is on the rise and that really does need to be addressed through a myriad of different policy measures, but most notably increasing the access to legal support for tenants at the front lines of illegal evictions.
Mm-hmm. If I could just add to that really briefly, thanks, Alex. I think what's also interesting is that many people are being discriminated against on the basis of classes of identity that are protected by provinces' human rights codes. So for instance, race, gender, sexuality. But then there are also some elements that are not protected on human rights codes that are pushing people out of housing. So for instance, social condition is only protected in a couple of provinces, the amount of money one has or their income, which Professor David Holchansky, who's on the call, thanks for joining us, Professor Holchansky, has spoken about extensively in his work as well. So people are being essentially discriminated against for living close to the poverty line or on the basis of a criminal record. That's not a protected class, and people who landlords are allowed to ask for a record of offenses. And that allows people to push people who have criminal records out of housing. And of course, that can heighten the chance that they will fall into crime. But we also see housing providers evicting people before someone is even convicted. So for instance, in Toronto Community Housing, someone who was arrested before they were convicted, their family was evicted from housing. So governments are perpetuating it as well, not even strictly individual landlords.
Okay, thank you. We've got Natalie Duchesnay next. She's got a question about community land trusts. Natalie?
Thank you. I am really curious about the community land trust. I think it's an interesting idea. I'd like to know more about the role the provinces and the municipalities play, both in the creation of support, but also the funding of community land trusts.
That's an interesting question. Thank you, Natalie. I would say that there's no one way that it happens. Community land trusts start either by a donation of land or by a fundraising activity that ends up with a purchase of the land. That can and often is in cooperation with the municipality, but it doesn't necessarily have to, is my understanding. On the management of it is actually quite interesting because most community land trusts adopt a three-part governing model where a third of the board is made up of public service workers, a third of the board is made up of leaseholders, and a third of the board is made of community members who pay duties to the community land trust but not necessarily live within the housing complex. Apart from that, the CMHC just released a new, quite literally a few weeks ago, initiative called the Demonstration Initiative, which provides new funding for community land trust, which should be quite exciting and should probably, and will hopefully change the relationships between them.
Okay, if anybody has follow-up questions from things you've heard, please feel free to put them in the chat box and I will collect those in our third segment for the general Q&A. I'm going to move now to our representatives from CMHC. Now, I have not seen anything yet from CMHC people in the chat box, but if you are out there in Zoom land, please feel free to unmute yourself and just speak your question. And if not, I've got...
Sorry, Christopher, I was trying to get off mute there. It's Michel Tremblay. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy Innovation. And I do know that we have other members from I can't see all of them, but I know Charmarquet and Patrick Neptune are there and Nirusha are there. So please feel free to pipe in. So I had the privilege of having this presentation last week, I believe. So they're all very interesting ideas. A lot of them, we also have, and the students know that, we have to navigate the federal, provincial, what's under federal jurisdictions and so forth, and the students are quite aware of that. And so I think some of these are very interesting actually to be, and we will be looking. I'm particularly interested in the recommendation on audits, to be honest. That is something that would be very interesting to get further information, dig into it and see what we can do in Canada. Again, in consideration of federal versus provincial jurisdictions, and so Landlord and Tenant Act are legislated in provinces, but it certainly has piqued my interest, let's just say. So I don't have any particular questions, Christopher. I think the work was well done and good consultations and a cross sector of different, like they said, they've consulted people who are advocates, researchers and so forth. So no questions on my side, but I certainly invite Patrick and Nirusha or Charmarquet, and there might be others that are there from CMHC.
Yeah, I don't know Narusha, but she sounds like a bit of a troublemaker.
Oh, she is.
yeah.
She's very much a troublemaker.
So rude, Chris. So rude.
Okay, but even though you had no specific question, Michelle, I wonder if anybody from the team wants to comment and say anything more about the audit that piqued Michelle's interest.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I know we briefly discussed this with Michelle, but this is really a recommendation that was recognized by Carlos Tejera and Joe Darden, two researchers in the field. And they really observed the national housing audits that HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department in the US, carry out. And I think this speaks to one of the questions in the chat about international jurisdictional examples. And so these national audits are carried out every 10 years at a national scale, as well as kind of at a smaller state scale in between those years. And what's really interesting about them, and they've been carried out for decades now, is the US's ability to carry out these national housing audits, where often it can be hard to really pinpoint housing discrimination, especially if someone doesn't come forward to a human rights commission. And so these national audits, what they do is that they do pair testing. So there might be one individual who moves forward and maybe calls a prospective landlord or a prospective house and self-identifies as perhaps a racialized community or a member of someone with a disability. And then they will also have somebody else call or attend and kind of have a different identity or a different intersection of identities. And so what the paired testing does is compare the experiences of those people. And they found that it's really one of the best ways to identify housing discrimination kind of through this quasi-experimental method.
So Mario, just to clarify, this is prospective, for example, renters that call the landlord and both want to see the same apartment within the same day. And we've heard of these stories, by the way, anecdotally, that one person of color, for example, a Black Canadians will show up and when they show up, they'll be told, no, the apartment's rented. And then they get their friend to actually go in the next day, phone again, they're white, and they get to see the apartment. That's essentially some of the work they're doing. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
And if I could just add a quick, oh, sorry, Mario, were you going to say something else? If I could just, something else that I find very interesting about this recommendation, or I guess two things, is the first one is it can be done through funding community researchers, right? It doesn't have to be centralized. You can put out a research program offer for multiple researchers across the nation every 10 years, every 5 years. And maybe that way getting around some of the jurisdictional problems. And the other interesting thing is that you're able to find some, when you do it every few years, you're able to find some really interesting things. Like the 2012 audit from HUD showed that discrimination for Latino and Black households actually decreased at inquiry, but the steering into minority neighborhoods drastically increased. So if you're only looking at one of them, you may have a sense that discrimination overall went down. But by looking at multiple years, you're able to see how it's actually changing. And maybe the ways that we address it should be changing too.
Okay, folks, I am mindful of the time. We've only got 12 minutes before we all disappear. I've got 6 questions still coming, so I'm going to encourage everybody to ask their question quickly and to answer it fairly quickly. I've got a second question from CMHC. This is from Julia. Julia, if you can turn on your camera and pose your question, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you so much for your presentation. I work in the research division at CMHC, so great to see this work. And my question is really around if you could expand on any kind of gender differences that you uncovered in your work and sort of specifically try to connect that back to some of your recommendations going forward. If you were to take a gender lens to some of your recommendations, what would you sort of offer in that respect? Thank you.
I think for us, when gender really emerged as a particularly prominent issue, it was when gender identities were also intersecting with other identity groups as well. So case studies looking at instances of single mothers being denied potential housing, and also case studies around refugees who were women. I think taking a gender-based analysis approach is beneficial in certain ways, but to also frame it purely within the lens of gender and not consider multiple different intersecting analyses can be a bit of a difficult element to it. And while Gender-Based Analysis Plus does by all means recognize different intersecting identity factors, the framework that currently exists at the national level that you are able to take if you are accessing federal training programs does still focus preeminently on gender above other identity markers. So I think for our group as a whole, it was really going beyond gender and approaching it through an intersectional lens in recognizing that gender, when it meets class, when it meets race, when it meets disability status, is when the issue of gender discrimination is particularly harmful, damaging, and has these really particularly prominent case studies where individuals and entire communities are facing profound discriminatory practices. So as a whole, when looking at different lenses that we could use to approach this work, we did consider a Gender-Based Analysis Plus. We did utilize it in a variety of different capacities when collecting data and conducting interviews. But as a whole, we really did want to emphasize that intersectional element to it all.
Thanks, Alex. I'll just add to that super quickly. I think one example in the research that was particularly alarming was one that looked at women experiencing gender-based violence and who had to take refuge in shelters, and found that those women, while inquiring about apartments, I believe, if memory serves, faced up to 10 times as much rejection as the sort of a person who was not in that situation. And of course, you know, gender-based violence isn't something that affects solely women. And I do think there is a dearth of investigation of people who are trans, people who are non-binary, two-spirit, and I would be really curious to see what their experiences in housing as well. We did to also come across a study, I believe, from Sarah, the one looking at South Asian males. They faced pretty high levels of discrimination. So I think there are also racist tropes of, you know, racializing Black men as dangerous or people that they don't feel comfortable renting to and things like that. So that's sort of another element that came up in the research.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to move to the general Q&A for our final 10 minutes. And I've got in this order, Matisse, and then Julieta, then Shahid, then John, and then Nee. So if we're going to get through these all, they have to be short and snappy on both sides. So Matisse, another troublemaker, welcome back.
Thank you, Chris. First of all, congratulations, everyone. I was in your shoes last year. I know the feeling, 10 minutes away from closing that Zoom and completing your master's degree. So congrats for that. My question is around the third pool recommendations around housing supply. And I was curious to hear you about if there was a more present issue around the quantity of housing units or the quality of housing units available at affordable prices. And if you ran into something on that like tension in your research or through the interviews you conducted. Thank you very much.
Yes, absolutely. We ran into that tension. I think part of the problem that we kept coming back to, and I'll try to keep this really short, is that this housing crisis is a housing crisis, and there's like so many things that need fixing that it's really hard to pinpoint where to start. Like, for example, in social housing alone, this year we saw a drastic increase in the funds that went out from, not this year, with the National Housing Strategy, we saw a drastic increase in the funds that went to social housing, which is great, but most of it went for repairs because the stock is in need of like this for repair. So I think it's a difficult tension to resolve, and I don't think we ran into any clear indication of which one is a priority. I think we all hope that we can handle both at the same time.
Okay, Julieta.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Julieta, I'm the Deputy Director of the Shift. I work with Leilani Farha, who you interviewed in your project. Just really quickly, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I just wanted to know if you guys had given any thought about widening the scope a little bit around discrimination experienced by people living in homelessness and encampments, and how that shapes municipal policy, for example, towards encampments, like things we've seen like in the city of Toronto and Halifax and Sudbury and just so many places across Canada. And also how federal funds that are going towards developing supportive housing are kind of being thwarted at the municipal level because of NIMBYism. So if you've given any thought to that or what role CMHC could play in addressing that kind of discrimination, I'd be so happy to hear it because that's what we're working on too.
Who would like to take a shot at that?
Maybe I could just jump in really briefly. Wonderful to have you here. I think the Shifts report from last year about taking a human rights approach to encampments was really useful to us in thinking about how housing discrimination happens. Because of course you can't simply evict people out of encampments to put them in other very unstable situations that don't conclude in a safe and affordable and accessible place to live. So because we were looking at housing discrimination in the housing market, specifically with CMHC, we did decide to look more at living in units, but thinking about, the greatest conclusion of housing discrimination, the most severe, is homelessness. And that does happen, right? And we know that evicting people into homelessness is supposed to be in contrast with the UN's laws about housing, but that it does in fact happen. So in terms of thinking about encampments, it's about, the dearth of affordable and accessible houses to live and supports to get there. So in that way, I think it touches on people living in homelessness and encampments. But it was a conversation that we did repeatedly have, recognizing that many of us live, blocks away from some of these encampments and witnessing the violence firsthand that people are going through. So I think there's absolutely a role for CMHC to play in perhaps some of the relationships with municipalities and thinking about who is prioritized in housings that they get development for and what are the direct routes for people who are experiencing homelessness to get into those affordable units that are being made.
Thank you. Next question is to Shahid.
Thank you, team. The excellent presentation. I just have a quick one, keeping in mind the constitutional limits with federal and the provincial governments and the tension therein. I was just wondering if we have some role of provincial and federal collaboration or any legal amendment that the team thinks that it should be there to protect those people against such discriminations.
Thanks, Shahid.
I think we're all trying to give our team members the space to answer questions. But I think, Shahid, thank you for your question. I think that the most perhaps clear avenue is through landlord and tenant boards. And so some of them do have strong mediation capabilities, do have sets in place where I think one of the barriers at times is a fee that you may have to pay to issue or to file a claim. So sometimes we see that as a barrier. Certain jurisdictions have waived that fee for submitting a claim. We also see sometimes the length of time that it takes kind of for the process to carry out can be a barrier. So I think sometimes it's more about how it plays out rather than the structures that are in place. And I think I would go back to what Alexandra was saying about accountability and ensuring that those systems and those regulations are in fact effective and able to serve these individuals, both landlords and tenants, to the best. And I think it also goes back to that campaign about really amplifying existing rights and responsibilities so that all parties are informed at the start. And also recognizing how different services may disproportionately disadvantage certain populations. And so Alexandra also mentioned online eviction hearings. And from our research, we found that some individuals really struggled with either internet access, getting notice that the eviction hearing was taking place. And so sometimes they weren't even present when the kind of decision took place. So ensuring that, as we move forward with technology and those offerings, that we're also recognizing the impacts on different individuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Marielle. Okay, next question to John Stewart.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I think we're out of time, but maybe rather than ask my question, I'll just add to what Marielle said. I'm a small landlord in Ottawa, and I just signed a lease with someone yesterday. And I'd say that landlord and tenant boards are too slow operating to be effective. They might as well not exist from the point of view of my tenants and myself. It simply takes too long, months before you will even get a hearing scheduled. So it's not useful. And therefore, it's a matter of power between the landlord and the tenant.
Okay, so am I now going to Niadi for the very last question?
So yeah, thanks again. I'm very conscious of time here. I see the multiple things that you've proposed, right? This is a very complex issue. So the question I had, which I put in the chat, had to do with what would you say are the next steps if you were working with CMHC? What are some of the first next steps that you would take? There was a question about, for example, something like reparations. It's politically challenging. What might be some of the first steps to take with something like that? But maybe more broadly, just some of the next steps that you might state.
I would just say very quickly, and maybe give a chance to someone else to close it out, but collaboration. Like CMHC, I think we've heard this from CMHC and we've heard this from the advocates from both sides. They want to sit at the table. CMHC wants to hear from them and they want to be listened. So I think the first thing, and this is throughout our recommendations, is we need to create the appropriate space to ensure that their needs and opinions are being taken care of.
And I think I also want to recognize CMHC's existing commitment to atonement efforts, specifically for Hogan's Alley and Africville and Halifax. And I think that the opportunity there is it's very early days still of CMHC's atonement efforts, but is really being able to signal a commitment to funding. I think that's something that we heard from the communities, especially as they progress with this sort of engagement and historical context and experiences. We really do think there's an opportunity to express a commitment to funding kind of early on as these atonement efforts move forward.
Okay, folks, thank you very much. I want to wrap this up. Everybody needs a 1-hour break before the next one starts. I want to thank you all for being here. At my count, there were 56 people out there in Zoom land watching this presentation. So thank you all for attending. Special thank you to CMHC for sponsoring this policy lab. I think it's just terrific that you are there. And if I understand it correctly, you will be there in the near future.
We are, yes, that is correct.
Also, a special thank you to Lucy Locke. Lucy Locke, the professor from social work, and the coach of this team. Thank you very much, Lucy, for your time and your commitment. And final thank you, of course, to the team. So Alexandra, Mariel, Rudena, Ricardo, Rebecca, terrific job. Thank you very much for setting a high bar for sessions 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 that will follow you. So congratulations. And everybody will be back here at 10 o'clock my time, which is 11 o'clock your time, for team number 2. And we'll see you then. Thank you all very much.